Speaking for the trees, no matter where they're from. The podcast.
Today, we're joined by Paul Moss. He's the executive director of the Plant Initiative, and he's the author of a recent report that the Plant Initiative put out in December called Towards a Plant Advocacy Movement. And so, Paul, if you could start off just telling us a little bit about yourself and, your qualifications, your background, and how this all came to be for you with the Plant
Sure.
Initiative.
Well, yeah, thanks so much. Really happy to be here with you today and have the opportunity to talk about this. So I have been interested in really the human-plant connection for my whole life, just since I was a kid, and now I'm 67 years old. So it's been for a long time. And I think one of the things that's really intrigued me about the topic of how humans connect with plants is just what are plants, and are plants, able to sense things? Are they intelligent? What exactly are they? And I think that scientific research over the past decades, and even when I was younger, there had been some scientific research as early as the late 1800s and early 1900s, which really examined how plants are sentient beings. And I think that there's been a lot more recently done by scientists on that topic. So I think I've always been kind of intrigued with what are the implications of that. So if plants are sensing and plants are intelligent, what does that mean in terms of how humans, especially in our dominant culture, how we should be treating plants? So anyway, in terms of my background, I have an undergraduate degree in biology, and I have a master's degree in agriculture and agronomy. And I also have an MBA in marketing. And right now I'm a non-traditional student working on a PhD in geography, environment, and society. And one of the things that I'm interested in studying right now are some of the ethical issues about how we relate to crop plants grown in an agricultural context, especially corn. So in terms of the Plant Initiative, I felt like there's really was an opportunity and a niche that was important to fill for people that are looking at plants in this type of a way, through a lens of trying to see how we're treating them, and are we treating them appropriately, and especially for what they really are. And so the Plant Initiative's goal is to help build a movement of people, or to gather people, or provide a catalyst for people that are interested and thinking about plants in a different way and want to move forward in operationally in terms of trying to better help to treat plants in a more respectful manner.
Yeah, excellent. I was really excited to hear about the Plant Initiative last year. But it seems like there's some really interesting things you're doing. You've had a couple of different presentations this year with different authors.
Right. The Plant Initiative has been trying to highlight some of people that are doing interesting work in the world of the human-plant connection. So we had a discussion with Prudence Gibson, who has recently an Australian scholar who has recently written a book about some of the stories of the plants in the Australian National Herbarium. We've had Paco Calvo and Natalie Lawrence, who recently wrote a book called Planta Sapiens, and that book is a really good collection of information and overview of plant intelligence, and really discusses some of the research on that. And we've also had Michael Martyr and Giovanni Alloy talking about their recent book on art and philosophy and plants. So we're trying to provide a broad way for people to learn more about plants. And all our programs are free, and they're available online and also recorded. If you miss them and want to find them, you can go to the Plant Initiative's YouTube site or our website and access all of the recordings. We kind of see ourselves as an international kind of based organization, even though I'm located here in Minnesota. We have board members in a variety of different states, and our audience is really people throughout the world that are interested in this topic. I think one thing that makes the organization a little bit unique is that we're not just based in the scientific worldview, and so we try and also promote events and opportunities that involve, I'd say, other ways of knowing things. So it could be through intuition or cultural perceptions of things. And so we're trying to not limit ourselves just to kind of conventional accepted Western ways of knowing things, but also want to be respectful of that, both indigenous cultures as well as many alternative cultures within our dominant society also have ways of learning about and communicating and connecting with other beings that are not really science-based.
I thought it might be useful if we're going to dive into the report. I just wanted to read the first couple of paragraphs of it just to give people sort of a flavor of it. And so I was going to start there. There's not currently an identifiable movement that advocates on behalf of plants. Serious consideration of ethical treatment of plants, plant rights, and plant personhood remains on the margins of academic thought and popular understanding. However, there are many disconnected components of what could potentially constitute such a movement. This report presents reasons why such a movement is timely, outlines challenges that such a movement would face, considers what can be learned from the animal advocacy movement, and suggests potential approaches that could be used for operationalizing a plant advocacy movement. And so within the report, you have a few sections, for example, trends supporting a plant advocacy movement, challenges facing the plant advocacy movement, what can be learned from the animal advocacy movement, and how can plant ethics be operationalized. So I thought we might just start with your first section there, trends supporting a plant advocacy movement. And there you're talking about different organizations or different movements or different kinds of thoughts that have been moving around in the culture that already support a plant advocacy movement that could sort of provide a starting point. So if you want to talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I part of the reason for starting the plant initiative at this time was that it seems like there's a multitude of factors that are kind of coming together. They're kind of converging and really support at least people looking at plants in this different way. So one of the things I've mentioned already is just that there's a lot of scientific research that's being done on plants and plant consciousness and plant intelligence. And a lot of this has really been seeping into the kind of the public sphere. Just if you ask people, can plants communicate with each other? Or there's people that are familiar with some of the research that's been done by Suzanne Simard and others on how, in forests that the trees can exchange information and nutrients between each other using mycorrhizae in the soil. And there's been increasing numbers of people that have been doing research that are identifying some very advanced capabilities of plants. So I think that one of the reasons that people can start looking at plants in a different way is just that there is more known now about plants and what they are really capable of. And another issue is within the academic world. There's been a greater focus on plants in philosophy and environmental ethics. There's something called the quote vegetal turn. It's an academic term, but it just means that for a variety of reasons, plants are starting to become more cool to think about and to write about and to research. And so that's another thing, independently of what's going on with the scientists. This is more the humanities, where people are starting to think more about plants. And one of the things that's probably contributed as well is just during COVID, a lot of people were inside and their regular routines were somewhat broken, and they started having more connection maybe with the plants in their in their lives. Maybe they bought some house plants to keep them company in their home while they were kind of trapped in there, or they were spending more time in their yard or in parks. But anyway, I think that also opened up people's time and minds in terms of connecting with plants. And another thing that's really contributing to this being timely is the Rights of Nature movement, which is an international movement through which basically different governmental units, small or large, are starting to recognize that the natural world has its own rights and it should have legal standing. And when you start talking about the natural world, that of course is going to include plants, because if you look at what is alive on this planet and what do people see, most of the living biomass, almost all of it on this planet, on the surface of the planet, is plants. And so when we're talking about rights of nature, rights of forests, we're talking in a way about rights of plants, even if they might not be specifically talking about plant rights. So plants are benefiting from this broader rights of nature movement, which is really starting to have some early successes in countries such as Ecuador and other places, where they're actually starting to have legal decisions in courts that will stop certain types of destructive mining or other projects just because of what the implications for the natural world and the standing of the natural world that needs to be considered. Another factor is animal rights. Animal advocacy has been very successful in terms of getting people to think about the obligations that they have to treat other non-human beings well. And that is reflected both in terms of veganism, where people want to avoid eating any animal products that are raised, on farms or killed or otherwise. And also just, some people don't go that far and they are interested in just more humane treatment of animals. But I think that people are very connected with animals in many ways. They have pets. They realize that animals are sensitive beings that can feel pain, that have emotions like we do. And so there's increasing comfort with that and increasing legal also recognition of that and standards, that people have to follow when they're dealing with animals. And we feel that sets the tone for potentially extending that beyond animals. I think one of the challenges with the animal rights movement, even with all of its successes, and I support, the animal rights movement, is just that there is a line there. I think that, like right now, there's a line for many people between what's okay to do for a human and what's okay to do for an animal. And that expresses itself in terms of how animals are raised. But the animal rights movement has set another line, and and there's what's okay for animals. And then if you're a plant or fungi or microorganism or mineral or whatever, you're not really covered by that. So they've in a way drawn a line, and it's an appropriate thing to do to include animals, but we're just saying that let's include other living beings as well, not just animals. There's also been a trend towards increasing greater openness to indigenous and other alternative ways of knowing. And I've mentioned that the Plant Initiative is supports people considering those ways of understanding the natural world. And I think that indigenous culture, I can't identify as an indigenous person to express that, and better for indigenous people to express their own culture. But my understanding is that it really involves a sense of reciprocity and relatedness with all the beings on the planet. And so when you start looking more horizontally at other beings on the planet and a more permeable way of relating to other beings on the planet, I think that really is helpful in terms of people connecting more to plants. And I think one other issue is just that we're in the middle of an ecological crisis for people that are tracking what's going on with biodiversity, what's going on with the various habitats throughout the world. They're under a lot of stress, both because of climate change, because of habitat destruction, because of pollution, a lot of other reasons. And I think that as people are concerned and they want to like help to preserve our planet, a lot of that is going to include preserving plant life on the planet. Because as I mentioned, almost all of the living biomass on this planet are plants. So when we want to preserve ecosystems, we want to preserve the environment, that's also preserving plants. And I think the plants also are now known through research to improve human quality of life. That when we are out in a green area, green space, or even just looking at green plants, there's health benefits for us. And so there's I think more of a recognition of how we relate to plants and what we benefit from plants. And I think all those factors that I've just mentioned are helping to lead towards potentially people seeing that they should be advocating for plants or treating them more respectfully.
Yeah, you didn't use the word, say, human supremacism or human centrism, for example, but I think that is one of the things that's been eroding slowly over the last few years due to some of these factors that you mentioned. So animal rights activists have definitely been trying to address human centrism and say, no, there are other creatures on the planet who also deserve, consideration, and then as people have become more acquainted with different indigenous views, those too, can be less, human centrism. And obviously, indigenous views and cultures are not monolithic, and there's many different kinds around the world that exist and have existed. But many of them do contain these threads or these strains of thought that are useful in this way and helpful in looking at the world in a different way that have been largely absent in Western thought, and certainly in agricultural in the agricultural way of looking at things. And I think it's very interesting that you have a background in would you say agronomy? It was right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It was weed science, actually.
Right. Okay. Right. Yeah. And I've been involved in farming in a lot of different ways. And sometimes as a plant lover or a plant advocate, working on farms has felt a little bit like maybe the kind of work that people do who are prison abolitionists. And so they go into prisons to work with prisoners, Sometimes it's felt a little bit like that, like where one of the best places to advocate for plants is on farms, because that's one of the front lines,
Well, I feel strongly about it in that I think that if you look at just the land mass that is covered with crop plants and plants used for agricultural purposes, otherwise it's really huge. So if we want to advocate for plants and how they're treated, I think we do have to get into the agricultural sphere. And I think that's a more fraught area. I think it's a lot easier for people to think about respecting like a 2,000-year-old redwood tree,
Right.
or maybe their house plant, or a house, or a tree in the park, or in their a bush in their yard. When you start thinking about these quote agricultural plants, they fall within kind of a different category, similar to what's happened in the animal rights movement, where you have people that will be maybe concerned with dogs, cats, rare endangered animals, whales, elephants, but yet they're not necessarily as concerned about cows, pigs, chickens that are raised in confined areas and and have really awful lives in many cases. So I think that it's easy to compartmentalize, and I think that it's important when you think about plants to take a broad picture of plants, although it makes it a lot more complicated to advocate, because it's, we are ultimately all dependent on, killing plants, eating plants, using plants to live. We're animals. We are not able to produce our own food from sunlight. We're dependent on plants who can photosynthesize to produce basically all of our food directly or indirectly. So whether we're eating plants directly or we're eating animals that are eating plants, we're dependent on killing plants to live. And so it's harder to have like moral clarity in terms of how you deal with plants was as compared with maybe like an endangered species or or a panda. Everyone could say, well, there's no reason we have to kill a panda. We could protect them all, set them aside. With plants, it's not that simple. And so I think that it calls for a challenging set of ways of interacting with agricultural plants and plants in general, and that it's not, you can't just segment them off and say, well, we're not going to kill them or use them. But I think that, we can learn a lot from indigenous perspectives where, we're using something or having that kind of relationship. It's life moves between various beings, and we're all interdependent, and we all have things to give each other and things to get from each other. So it's, instead of looking at just putting them aside as we don't touch them, it's more about how do we relate to them in a way that benefits them and respects them, but also allows us to survive. So I think that's the challenge.
The phrase living in relation has been the one that comes up more and more, and that we're not currently living in relation, with our food plants, most of us as individuals in the society, and then the approach of agriculture is generally not living in relation. It's seeing plants as resources, to be used, not just for food, but for making money, for economic concerns. And so that idea of living in relation, I think that's one of the keys to bring into this, to change how the discussion is, because agriculture, as you know, it's fundamentally a sort of a domineering process, the way that it works right now, especially in the industrial level. And I think that there's cultural reasons that this exists. There's the the quote dominion over all animals and plants, so that appears in Genesis there, and so those books were written by early agricultural societies as ways of describing their world and how they're going to relate to it. And so some of that goes back a ways. I also think that with plants and with agriculture, people are always like, that the sort of fallback is, oh, well, we have to eat, and of course we have to eat. But I think that there's a lack of understanding, especially in the United States, about how agriculture actually works and how much of it is focused specifically on us eating. So something like 40% of the land mass of the United States is devoted to agriculture and to pasture and rangelands, right? Nearly half. I mean, it's amazing, right? However, of all that land, only 20% is comprised by what people think of as what farming is. So like vegetables, fruits, nut orchards, olive oil orchards, grains, beans. That's only 20% of all of that agricultural land. Other big sections are growing a lot of corn for biofuels, right? That's something that we can talk about, that whether we should need to do that or how useful is that. Some of it is for export. So it's not for feeding people here, it's for making money for the farmers. So again, this is not simply just we need to eat, And then of course, a large portion of it, the largest portion of our agricultural land is raising food to feed to animals. The animal rights movement, vegans, et cetera, have done a really good job of pointing out, is that necessary? Do people need to eat that much meat? We don't need to get into all that today. But the main point I just wanted to make was just that when it comes to farming, people don't realize what a small amount of the farming industry at this point really is for what they're picking up in the produce section at the store.
Right. I think people have to, I think it's important in general, like what you're saying, is to segment the way that we look at agriculture and to recognizing that there are various types of agriculture. And when you're talking about industrial agriculture in the way that you did, I think that's really important, because that's the vast acreage that exists in our culture here. But there are, through indigenous agriculture and some of the other agricultural systems, which I know you're well acquainted with like permaculture, biodynamics, organic agriculture, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of different subtypes of agriculture which have different ways of looking at the plants that are involved. And some of those forms of agriculture, I would say, do involve respectfully connecting with those plants that are being grown. I think, particularly when you have a smaller scale, there's an ability for farmers to, or growers or horticulturalists or whoever, to have more of an individual relationship with the plants and to make sure that each individual plant is having as good a life as it could, is able to flourish as well as it could. And that's really hard to do at a scale for agricultural crops. If you're growing, let's say, thousands of acres of corn or soybeans, you don't have that ability to have that kind of personal connection. So, but I think that it's good to recognize that the agriculture is a super important area in terms of looking at plants ethically, and that there's a lot of implications to that.
Yeah, and the land use being not the smallest of them, because if we're talking about wanting to protect, if we're wanting to talk about protecting plants and ecosystems that are not domesticated, the single biggest threat to ecosystems is habitat destruction through human use, and the biggest category of habitat destruction is agriculture. The Amazon is, they're cutting down parts of the Amazon because they want to grow soy, or they want to put in, palm plantations or something like that. And while there's also, say, mining, that's going on in the Amazon, that's taking up a much smaller footprint, although obviously it has its own, toxic, legacy as well. So I think that realizing that it's very important to try to protect those areas that haven't been strongly disturbed at this point means needing to look at agriculture and how does it need to continue expanding in the way that it is. Well, are the motivations for its expansion having to do with feeding people, or are they having to do with, profit? And if we were to be, if we were to have a different kind of agricultural system that wasn't so focused on profit, could we, first of all, not destroy any more habitat, and then secondly, shrink the amount of land that we're using for agriculture right now, and so that some of it could be rewilded or have other approaches happen to it.
Well, I think one of the interesting things about agriculture is that because you're working with living beings, there are always a lot of alternative ways of interacting with them. And so some of the more, agroecological ways of growing crops, there's ways that can actually increase biodiversity depending on how you're growing the crops. And it wouldn't maybe make sense for certain types of industrial agriculture to do certain of these agroecological techniques, but there are ways that we can grow plants that will be good for the plants as well as for the earth, as well as for our own health. And so I think it's more of a question of like having people want to do that too. I think right now there's like a lot of incentives and subsidies and reasons why people are growing crops the way they do. And as you point out, a lot of it's not used for human food at all, and it's used for things that maybe even not very positive for anyone involved, So I think that, that there are ways of doing things. One thing I think about, and I don't know, it's a little off topic, but like with certain plants like corn, which are considered sacred beings, in many indigenous cultures, and when we kind of break the contract with that plant that they have in the indigenous cultures to treat it respectfully and to honor it, and we just kind of use it for just what humans want in the dominant culture, there's like a price to be paid. And I've kind of thought about that in terms of tobacco, another sacred plant that's kind of misused in the dominant culture. People, I wonder if there's like a free ride for exploiting other beings. I think
Right.
when you don't treat beings respectfully, there's consequences. And I think so for tobacco, we know the health impacts of that. And there's also problems in terms of soil fertility or whatever. And then in terms of corn as well, some of the products that are made from corn, through industrial processes like high fructose corn syrup, or various industrial things, or animals that are fed in feedlots with corn, and then there's or fertilization for corn that's creating dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, in North America. So I think there's a lot. There's no like free ride. I think we have to start looking, not only because it's the right thing to do for these other beings, the other plant beings, our relatives, but also because it's ultimately going to come back to us when we don't act respectfully. So I think it's like really important for our own like survival and for our planet's survival that we reorient the way that we look at and interact with plants, both in agricultural, horticultural, any kind of setting, because it's not, we think we're kind of getting away with something and doing what we want, but ultimately the bill is going to come due and is coming due.
There's been more public consciousness lately about different discoveries that have been made. And one of those, a lot of those have been around the fact that plants are able to communicate both with each other and with insects, in order to, for their own benefit. I think a lot of this is happening through chemicals that they release into the air, right? Something we could even call pheromones, perhaps. Did you want to talk about a bit about that for a moment?
Well, there's various volatile compounds, chemical compounds that plants can use for communicating, both in the air as well as through the soil, to help to, warn other plants that are near them, that there's a pest there. So these other plants can create various secondary metabolic compounds that can protect them, that could be, toxic, or that could help to dissuade some of these predators from eating. So I think that it's another good point about plants is that they do live in community. We think of plants as individuals, and I think when we think of rights and things like that, we typically think of individuals. But for plants, their lives are very intertwined with many other organisms, both other plants through which they have relationships, as you point out, through being able to communicate through chemical signals in a very complex language with many, many types of chemical signals. And then also with bacteria, with fungi, they're with insects. Plants are, very resourceful and able to meet their needs through collective kind of collaboration. And I think that's, it's another reason I think to respect them is just that they are very complex beings that are doing a lot. They're doing a lot that maybe we can't see. There's thoughts that plants are even using sound. They're certainly able to perceive sound. For example, there's been research when caterpillars are eating a leaf of a plant, they will send out signals that can notify other people just by playing the sound of a caterpillar eating a leaf. It will cause plants to change their chemical compounds and structure. So and bees as well. So they're listening, they're watching, they're sharing information, they're sharing nutrients, they're protecting each other. They're doing a lot, and I think it's really pretty amazing when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that what's become clear is that we can definitely say that plants have senses of different kinds, and some of those are really obvious ones, like that there are, the roots have, of plants have the abilities to detect moisture and to go, and to grow towards it or away from it as they need to, or certain minerals in the soil and to grow towards it or away from it. There are plants whose seeds require light for germination. There are, and so these are all senses that they're able to pick up on these different, on the light the temperature, the chemicals. There's, plants that need to get cold before the seeds need to get cold before they'll germinate. So all of these are senses. And then we pile on top of senses that we have, that they are also responses that are then going on, so they're sensing something, then they're responding. It's not plant growth is not, a random process in that way, and then I also recall, maybe it was in Mancuso's book, reading about a fascinating experiment where this woman did research on sensitive plants. Those are plants in the genus Mimosa, right? So the sensitive plant, a lot of people might know those ones from a nursery or whatever. That's the plant that you touch its leaves and they fold up, and so they respond to being touched or to a vibration. And so what she did is she had quite a few of these plants in hanging baskets in the laboratory, and she had it set up so that she could have the basket drop slightly and just give it a little bit of vibration, and that would cause the plant leaves to fold up as if it had been touched, because it had been agitated. But what she found was that if she repeated this over time, at some point they stopped doing it, because what appeared to be happening anyway, or how we would talk about it, is that it appeared that they were learning that this was not a real threat, that they didn't need to expend the resources to fold up like this. And so this further seemed to suggest something like memory. And so this is where, people get into different discussions about, oh, but they don't have, a brain stem. Oh, they don't have, nerve cells like animals do. So we can't consider that, quote, thinking or memory or something like that. And I think that this is where plant rights or advocating for plants is different than advocating for animals, because where a lot of advocacy for animals has been about showing how much animals are like us. I mean, we are a kind of animal after a while, maybe to some degree, sort of humanizing animals in order to make us feel a closer connection to them. I think that's not possible in the same way with plants, because they are so different, but I don't think it is necessary either. In terms of plants, I think that there's not a need to create that same equivalency as there is, and that it's more important to look at plants in terms of the fact that although they are different, that difference does not make them less legitimate.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think, with just about that study by her name is Monica Gagliano. If people are interested, and she's written a very interesting book called "Thus Spoke the Plant" too. If you're interested in her writing about her own work, I think the typical way of thinking about intelligence is that it's like a human characteristic, and then if you want to say that any other being is intelligent, then the burden of proof is on you to prove it. I guess for me, I'm thinking that every living being, including bacteria and microorganisms, they're all intelligent because, like you pointed out, every being is sensing a variety of different things: light, sound, temperature, moisture, all these different things. But they're integrating it. They're not like just giving like a rote response. It's not like, because it couldn't function that way. They have to be able to balance the fact that, okay, there's more water in this direction, but then there's more light in the other direction. And actually there's like a lawnmower that comes over and cuts us down at 7 inches. And then there's a bunch of insect pests. So they have to like figure out how to do all that. And every organism, whether it's an amoeba or a plant or a person or an animal, whatever, has to be able to integrate it. So I would say, every living being is intelligent. And it does get at this whole issue about anthropocentrism, looking at everything from a human perspective, where we're the center of the universe, and then everything is like important as it relates to us. And I would say that I guess I see it as a more horizontal type of a way of looking at all the living beings. It's that they're all like equally advanced, they're all like equally important, and that they all, therefore, they're like beings that we need to be connecting with respectfully. So, but I think that you're right. The research that's been done on plant intelligence and plant sensing is good. One flaw in a way is thinking that just because we realize that plants are sensitive or intelligent or even conscious, that we're going to treat them well, because we do not yet treat humans well, as you can
Right.
read from the news every day. So,
Mhm.
so it's not like a guarantee. It's a nice step towards a more respectful way of being, but I think that it won't help enough, because even with farm animals on farms, people understand that they're suffering, that they're in bad conditions, and they're still doing it. So it's just having the raw understanding is not going to be enough, but it does help to make the case, and it does raise the ethical stakes, and it makes it a more complex thing. And so I think it pushes people in the right direction.
One possibility you mentioned in here for that you were talking about that was a trend that's getting more people interested in plant advocacy was the native plant movement. I mean, and I love native plants and I love native ecosystems, and I've supported tree sits in that sense, literally broken the law to help defend native plants. But the topic of invasive plants is in the native plant movement is, I think, a little bit problematic for the plant advocacy movement because what they're doing there is drawing a line and saying, here are plants that are worth saving, and here are plants that are not worth saving. And there's demonization that often happens of the introduced plants. And just with that word invasive, which makes it sound like they're armies or parachuters or tanks, right? So there's that's going on. And then there's also a lack of recognition that in the vast majority of cases, introduced plants are not able to establish in a new environment without human disturbance. And so human disturbance being the vector for these new plants, human disturbance is what needs to be addressed, because crop plants are not considered invasive. And so you have the perversity of being able to stand, in the middle of like an agricultural zone, like the Central Valley, or the Midwest or wherever, where it's agriculture as far as you can see to the horizon. But the criticism, and the bile or whatever is being brought to bear against a few plants that happen to be growing along the road or in the ditch there as being not native and not belonging, and being like, well, they wouldn't be here if the road wasn't here and the farm field or the orchard wasn't here, And so certainly not all native plant advocates have this attitude. I think that it's a subset who this is their cause, is that they want to get rid of all introduced plants, and some of them use very violent rhetoric, along this too. And so I just wanted to bring that up because it hadn't been mentioned in your report, but I felt like it was a challenge that's out there too.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like they're not being respected adequately, the non-native plants. I realize that there are situations. I think there's no like hard and fast rule that you can't, again, kill a plant or remove a plant or change the composition of plants in the environment. So I think that, I'm not saying to take a hard line on this, but I would agree with you that, that they're being unfairly demonized. They're just trying to live their life. They were brought there by human interference, as you point out. And, they also, there's a lot of ecological benefits to them being there. They're providing, shade, habitat, they're preventing soil erosion, they're doing things. And also plant communities are not permanent. So let's say you have a situation where there's invasive plants or they've taken over a certain area. It doesn't mean that looking ahead 50, 100, 500 years, if you leave it alone, that there's still going to be a monoculture of whatever it is, that plant that you don't like. Things change, and the living world has the ability to correct itself. So it's also a sense that humans have this obligation to manage the non-human world because we know best. But I would say I'm skeptical, just looking around and seeing what human management looks like. I would say it's not really working very well. So I would say if you have a situation where there's plants that maybe are out of place or that you don't really like them. If you take the long view, I believe that that problem will correct itself eventually, because around the world in natural environments, in wild environments, you don't really see that there's just one plant that will just completely dominate the landscape forever without human interference. So eventually it would correct itself. And I would say people should be patient and understand some of the benefits that these other plants, a lot of these, non-native plants are companions with humans for thousands of years and are related to our crop plants. They have medicinal gifts that they can give to people. They're maybe beautiful, so there's a lot of different aspects of what they're doing, that should make us rethink, the negativity that goes towards them. And I agree, it's not everyone, but I think that, it's important to kind of go out of your way to think about how can these plants that we don't particularly think we like, how can they actually be looked at in a positive light?
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that recognizing the subjective quality there is important too, and is often not acknowledged, and so the idea that, because it is in so many cases simply that, it's that plant is not liked, or for some reason, being able to prove that a plant is bad for a place is actually a very challenging thing to do, and in the field of invasion biology itself, there's a great lack of consensus. They're having debates all the time. Like on the science end of it, it's a very nuanced, discussion, in contrast to what's happening in popular media or in certain circles or whatever. But as someone who's advocating for plants and really advocating for life, but in terms of advocating for plants, I would say that the approach should be that death and killing things is an inevitable part of life. However, we should just not kill things without a good reason. And I don't consider aesthetics to be a good reason. I don't consider merely the pursuit of profit to be a good reason, et cetera. I would say that this is an ethical, issue for me. And you do address ethics in this report as well.
Yeah, well, I think that having a good reason is important, but also to include with your good reason, weighing the consequences on these other living plant beings and including that in that whole broader equation. So, because people do a lot of really bad things for good reasons. You know what I mean? It's like they think it's a good reason, and then they're doing horrendous things. So, but I think that, so it has to be both having a good reason and thinking about, well, you're destroying this other being's life, and that being doesn't want to have a destroyed life. So put that in your equation too, and think about it, because that other being still wanted to live.
You had a section in the report, how can plant ethics be operationalized? And that was kind of a big word. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about what you meant in this section.
Well, I think one of the challenges is, it's kind of an abstract concept to think about, well, we want to promote respect for plants, or we should treat plants ethically. So I think one of the challenges, well, beyond just maybe people on an intellectual level thinking, well, that maybe we should, but then what does it mean to do it? And I think that's part of the challenge. And so, there are ways that, we have some things on our website that we mention, in terms of how we can, treat plants, more respectfully. There's, reducing consumption of plants when it's not needed, and there's a lot of ways of doing that. So you don't waste plant lives, protecting and restoring plants, rethinking plants, putting in place, policies, that could, encourage people to think about plants in a different way, in a more positive way, teaching people about it. So it involves, education, outreach. In some cases, it might involve, policies towards various types of plants. But it's like the challenge is to like, how do you take this, like the animal rights movement has, they've had a concept of, we want to protect animals and that they should be treated respectfully and all that. And then they've kind of come up with various things. There's different laws. There's, humane treatment of animals, or there's veganism, I think for there, and there's many other, types of ways that people are voluntarily or non-voluntarily dealing with improving the lot of animals. And so I think for plants as well, I'm just saying at least take the first steps towards thinking about how can we actually move forward with this as a serious issue. Because I think there's a tendency to put down people that care about plants. There's like expressions like tree huggers. There's it's kind of seems for some people it seems on the fringe, and so I think it's to be taken seriously. It has to kind of make people think that there's some action that needs to be done. So that's kind of what I mean by operationalizing it.
Right. And it's funny that, it should be considered fringe to be interested in, a form of life on the planet, the kingdom of plants, without which our life here would be completely impossible.
Well, I agree. I think it's somewhat arrogant for people, and again gets back to anthropocentrism or human-centered thinking. That we're the center of everything here, and everything is here to serve us, and we have the right to do whatever we want to every other living being. And so I think that that's not true, and I think that the outcome of that attitude is what you see right now in terms of the ecological crisis that we're in. And that's what happens when you're not respecting the fact that all these other beings need to live here, and you think you can just do whatever you want. And then you're seeing the other beings dying out, they're leaving. The earth is in a very critical state right now. And so I think that it's important for our survival as a species to rethink and reorient the way that we look at plants as well as all other living beings.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I completely agree with that. And I do think that, well, this involves systemic things that are going on, not merely individual actions, but systems and policy. And it's rooted in a lot of these cultural ideas, too. And so that's why it's not, really just about like mentioning facts or this or that. But as you brought up in the report, that there's an important of story and emotions and fueling the movement is how you put it. And so really what we're talking about here is trying to introduce a different narrative or different narratives.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think if the Plant Initiative play a small part in promoting that and podcasts like this where you're thinking through these issues, and I know you've been thinking about these issues for a long time on your own, and I think that there's a need, I think, though, for people that are starting to think this way about plants to start to build connections with each other, to build collaboration, and to draw both encouragement from each other, to share and support each other, and to legitimize each other in this kind of a work. So I think that's one of the things that the Plant Initiative is trying to do through its programming, is to help build that sense that there are others that think this way, that this is an important and a legitimate way of thinking about so many other living beings, and that there's an opportunity to do a lot more.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited the Plant Initiative is even happening, and it was great to look at this report, and I really appreciate that you spent some time today talking to me about this. And can you just remind our viewers and listeners how they can follow the work?
Sure. On our website, plantinitiative.org, you can sign up for our email newsletter. We also have archived past copies of our newsletter. We have a YouTube site. We have an active Twitter site, Facebook. So there's a lot of ways that you can connect with us. And if you have any questions about anything, I can be reached at info@plantinitiative.org. My name again is Paul Moss, and I'm the executive director.
Well, thank you very much today, Paul. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much too. I enjoyed it. Take care.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, is also a blog at colibri.substack.com. That's KOLLIBRI.substack.com. Paid subscribers get exclusive blog posts and early access to podcast episodes. Intro beats by Big Joe Drummer. This outro music by Codebox. Join us again for another episode of Speaking for the Trees, no matter where they're from, the podcast.